May 20th, 1945. 12 days after the war in Europe officially ended, Canadian Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Kirk steps onto the Dutch island of Texel and finds something that shouldn't exist anymore. German soldiers, still armed, still fighting, not against the Canadians, against each other. Kirk later writes in his war diary that the scene feels like a musical comedy situation, except people are still dying. At the center of it all stands German Major Klaus Breitner, who has spent the last 6 weeks hunting men who wore the same uniform he does, refusing every order to stop, every plea to surrender, even after his own government no longer exists. The question isn't why the war continued on this forgotten island. The question is why one man kept fighting long after everyone else had gone home. If you enjoy diving deep into untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you the moments history almost forgot every single week. To understand what happened on Texel, you need to know 3 things. First, by April 1945, Germany is collapsing from every direction. The Rhine has been crossed, Berlin is surrounded, Hitler is in his bunker. Every rational German officer knows the war is over. Second, the island of Texel is garrisoned by the 802nd Infantry Battalion, but it's not a normal German unit. 800 of the 1,200 men are Georgians, former Red Army soldiers captured on the Eastern Front who were given a choice: die slowly in a prisoner of war camp or put on a German uniform and live. They chose to live, but they're under the command of 400 German officers and NCOs who don't trust them and never did. Third, these Georgians know exactly what's waiting for them when the war ends. Joseph Stalin has made it crystal clear: any Red Army soldier who surrendered to the enemy is a traitor. Surrender once to the Germans. Face execution when the Soviets find you. Wearing a German uniform just makes it worse. So you've got German officers commanding men who have every reason to hate them on an island that no longer matters strategically in a war that's already lost. The setup for what's about to happen couldn't be more perfect. And the man who's supposed to keep this powder keg from exploding is Major Klaus Breitner, a fanatical Nazi who believes surrender is treason no matter what Berlin says. Major Klaus Breitner is not the kind of officer who loses sleep over moral ambiguities. Ruthless is the word that appears most often in the historical record. Fanatical Nazi. Uncompromising. The kind of commander who sees the world in absolutes. You follow orders or you're the enemy. There's no middle ground. He's been commanding the 802nd Battalion since its formation in Poland back in June 1943, where they hunted partisans, then posting to the Dutch coast at Zandvoort for 17 months. Comfortable duty, all things considered. By February 1945, they're transferred to Texel, a beautiful island of endless beaches, productive farmland, sheep grazing in green pastures. For most of 1944, this was a plum posting. The Atlantic Wall defenses here became irrelevant the moment the Allies landed in Normandy. No one's coming to Texel. The war has moved east, into Germany itself. But Breitner isn't most officers. Even as the Reich crumbles, even as more pragmatic commanders are quietly making arrangements to survive the inevitable, Breitner remains a true believer. He trains his men hard. He maintains discipline with an iron fist. He expects absolute obedience. And he watches his Georgian troops with the suspicion of a man who knows he's commanding men who have every reason to want him dead. The Georgians under his command are led by Lieutenant Shalva Loladze, a 29-year-old former Red Army Air Force captain. Loladze is everything Breitner isn't. Where Breitner sees duty to the Reich, Loladze sees survival. Where Breitner sees traitors, Loladze sees men trapped between two empires that want them dead. The tension between these two men, between these two groups sharing the same uniform, has been building for months. Breitner knows it. Loladze knows it. Everyone on the island can feel it. What makes this situation so dangerous is that both men are absolutely committed to their positions. Breitner will never bend. He's not the type to question orders or make compromises for convenience. His worldview doesn't allow for surrender, doesn't allow for defeat, doesn't allow for the idea that sometimes you lose and you move on. To Breitner, what's about to happen on Texel isn't a military setback, it's personal betrayal. And betrayal in his mind deserves only one response. April 5, 1945. Major Breitner calls Lieutenant Loladze and his Georgian officers to a meeting. The order has come down from command. Half the Georgian troops are being transferred to the mainland. Tomorrow morning's 0700 hours, they ship out to Arnhem to join the fighting. For the Georgians, this is a death sentence delivered with German efficiency. Fight the advancing allies and die in combat. Refuse and get shot by your own officers. Survive and get captured, only to face Stalin's firing squads for being collaborators. There's no good option. There's only degrees of how you die. The Georgians have been talking about this possibility for months. They've made contact with the Dutch resistance through their previous posting at Zandvoort. They know the Allies are close. They know the war is nearly over. They just need to survive long enough to surrender to the British or Canadians, prove they fought against the Nazis, and maybe, just maybe, avoid Stalin's revenge. Loladze and his officers meet in secret in a small grove of trees. They make a decision that will turn Texel into Europe's last battlefield. They're going to mutiny. They're going to kill every German officer and NCO on the island. They're going to take control and hold it until the Canadians arrive. It's desperate, it's brutal, but it's the only path they can see that doesn't end with their deaths. They plan it meticulously. At precisely 0100 hours on April 6th, every Georgian soldier knows exactly which German he's responsible for. No guns. Too loud, too likely to raise an alarm before the job is done. Knives and bayonets. Silent. Efficient. The Georgians share barracks with the Germans. They know exactly where everyone sleeps. The plan depends on speed and total surprise. If even one German makes it to a telephone, if even one battery position gets a warning, the whole thing falls apart. The Georgians call it the day of birth. Midnight passes. 0100 arrives. Across the island of Texel, in barracks and bunkers, 800 Georgian soldiers rise from their beds. What happens next is one of the most savage nights of violence in the entire war. They move through the darkness with bayonets and knives. Most of the 400 Germans die in their sleep. Some wake to find their own troops standing over them. They die confused, not understanding why men in the same uniform are killing them. The Georgians are methodical. Room by room, barracks by barracks. The killing continues through the early hours of April 6th. By dawn, approximately 200 German officers and NCOs are dead. The Georgians control almost the entire island. Dutch civilians wake up to find Georgian soldiers telling them they're free. People pull flags from cellars where they've been hidden for 5 years and hang them from windows. A surgeon named Peter Wiening answers his door at 0500 to find 2 Georgians in German uniform saying good morning. Texel is free. But the plan has already failed in the most critical way. They didn't get everyone. The southern and northern naval batteries, manned by German sailors, repelled the Georgian assault. And they didn't get Major Breitner. Because Breitner wasn't in the barracks that night. He was in the village of Denburg, in bed with his mistress, a local Dutch woman. When he hears the gunfire in the distance, his first thought is that the Canadians have landed. Then he realizes the weapons being fired are German. His own troops have mutinied. Other officers would surrender. Other officers would recognize the situation is hopeless. Not Breitner. He forces a local fisherman at gunpoint to row him across to the mainland to Den Helder. He reaches a telephone. He calls his superiors. His message is simple. Texel has fallen to mutineers. He wants reinforcements. He wants to take the island back, and he has no intention of showing mercy. What any reasonable German officer would do at this point is obvious. The war is over. Berlin is surrounded. The Wehrmacht is surrendering by the thousands every single day. Texel is a small island with zero strategic value. Let the Georgians have it. Let the Canadians sort it out when they arrive. Save whatever German soldiers are left and wait for the inevitable. Klaus Breitner is not a reasonable officer. On April 6th, as the sun rises over an island stained with blood, Breitner is already coordinating a counterattack. He doesn't see a military problem to be managed. He sees traitors who must be punished. The word he uses, both at the time and for the rest of his life, is treachery. Not mutiny, not rebellion, treachery. In his worldview, the Georgians weren't soldiers making a desperate bid for survival. They were traitors who deserved execution, uniform or not, surrender or not. Berlin responds to Breitner's request with remarkable speed for a government that's literally falling apart. Take back the island. Show no mercy. By the afternoon of April 6th, German reinforcements begin arriving. The 163rd Marine Infantry Regiment, 2,000 combat-hardened troops. Some sources say closer to 3,000 when you count stragglers from other Wehrmacht units who join the fight. They're ferried across from the mainland, landing on an island where the Georgians are still celebrating liberation. The German artillery batteries that the Georgians failed to capture in the opening hours now begin shelling Georgian positions. Breitner leads the counterattack personally. He's not sitting in a command post. He's in the field, directing operations, hunting the men who tried to kill his officers while they slept. The Georgians, who thought they'd won their freedom, suddenly find themselves fighting a real battle against numerically superior forces with artillery support. They try to hold fixed positions, but it's hopeless. Superior German firepower drives them back. The Dutch civilians who raised their flags find themselves in the middle of a nightmare. The Germans, furious at what they perceive as Dutch cooperation with the mutineers, start shooting anyone who helped the Georgians. Resistance fighters are executed. Ordinary citizens who gave them food or shelter are killed. Farms go up in flames as the Germans use scorched earth tactics on their own occupied territory. The villages of Denburg and Ireland see serious destruction. Witnesses describe a reign of terror. Any Georgian captured is given a particular punishment designed to strip away the last shred of dignity. Breitner's orders are specific. Make them remove their Wehrmacht uniforms. They disgraced those uniforms by their treason. Make them dig their own graves, then execute them. By April 21st, the Georgians have lost every fixed position. Loladzi's dream of an organized resistance controlling the island is over. His men retreat to the countryside, breaking into small groups, hiding in fields, in haystacks, in the homes of Dutch civilians brave enough to shelter them. The lighthouse on the northern tip of the island is the last stronghold to fall. 57 Georgians hold it until they run out of ammunition. When they finally surrender on April 20th, Hitler's birthday, they're marched out, forced to strip, forced to dig. Then shot. Loladzi himself is captured a few days later. He's executed on April 25th. The man who led the uprising, who thought he could save his men, dies in a Dutch field, stripped of his uniform, buried in an unmarked grave. But here's where Breitner's decision becomes truly incomprehensible. May 5, 1945. All German forces in the Netherlands officially surrender to the Canadians at Wageningen. Lieutenant General Johannes Blaskowitz signs the documents. Every German commander in the country receives orders. Lay down your arms, the war is over. Breitner refuses. May 8, 1945, VE Day. Germany surrenders unconditionally. All across Europe, guns fall silent. Soldiers on both sides wander in a daze, unable to process that it's finally over. The permanent barrage that's been their companion for months stops. Celebrations erupt in every Allied capital. Wine flows in the streets of Paris. People dance in Trafalgar Square. And on Texel, Klaus Breitner keeps hunting Georgians. His justification, when anyone asks, is simple. This isn't war. This is dealing with a mutiny. German forces surrendered to the Allies. But the Georgians aren't the Allies. They're mutineers, traitors. The surrender documents don't apply. He's not fighting the Canadians. He's executing criminals who violated military law. In his mind, the war ending changes nothing about what he's doing. The hunt continues. The story gets even more unbelievable. Stick around to find out what the Canadians discovered when they finally reached the island. Through early May, while the rest of Europe celebrates peace, Texel remains a killing ground. Small groups of German soldiers comb the island, searching farms, checking haystacks, interrogating terrified Dutch civilians. When they find Georgians hiding, the ritual is always the same. Strip off the uniform, dig the grave, stand at the edge, fire. The Georgians who remain alive, maybe 200 of them by mid-May, are fighting as partisans now. Hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage. They know they can't win. They're just trying to survive long enough for someone to save them. The Dutch resistance does what it can, hiding men in attics and cellars, but the reprisals are vicious. 120 Dutch civilians will die before this is over. Some killed in crossfire, but many executed for the crime of showing mercy to desperate men. On April 8th, 10 Dutch resistance members and 4 Georgians steal the island's lifeboat, the Joan Hodgson. They sail across the North Sea in a desperate 24-hour voyage, reaching the English coast at Mundersley. Their mission is to get help, to convince the Allies to land on Texel to stop the slaughter. They're brought to London, interrogated by intelligence officers. What they don't know is that British intelligence already knows everything that's happening on Texel. Code breakers at Bletchley Park have been intercepting German radio communications about the situation for weeks. The Allied commanders make a cold calculation. Germany is collapsing. Every resource is focused on final victory. They're not diverting troops or aircraft to a small island for what looks like an internal German discipline problem. The mission fails. Only a single reconnaissance aircraft ever flies over Texel. The Georgians and Dutch civilians are on their own. The fighting grinds on through the third week of May. Breitner shows no sign of stopping. He's spent 6 weeks hunting these men with a single-minded intensity that borders on obsession. German soldiers under his command later describe him as utterly convinced of his rightness. He's not violating the surrender. He's enforcing military justice. The fact that his government no longer exists doesn't change the fundamental nature of their crime. They killed German officers in their sleep. That's not combat, that's murder. And murder, in Breitner's worldview, demands execution, regardless of what's happening in Berlin or anywhere else. His men keep fighting because he orders them to. Some probably agree with him. Some are probably just following orders out of habit, out of fear, out of not knowing what else to do. The Wehrmacht command structure on Texel still functions, even though the Wehrmacht itself has surrendered. May 20th, 1945, 12 days after VE Day, 2 weeks after every other German unit in the Netherlands laid down their weapons, Canadian forces, led by Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Kirk, finally land on Texel. They come unopposed, expecting to find a quiet island recovering from occupation. Instead, they find something out of a fever dream. German soldiers, still armed, still fighting. Georgians hiding in the countryside. Dutch civilians traumatized by weeks of violence that continued long after peace was supposed to arrive. Kirk's war diary entry captures his bewilderment. He describes it as a musical comedy situation, except it's real and people are dying. The Canadians discover the scope of what's been happening. They find mass graves. They hear stories from Dutch witnesses about executions, about farms burned, about a German major who refused to stop even when his own government told him the war was over. Over the next 2 days, May 20th and 21st, the Canadians disarm 1,500 German soldiers, not prisoners of war. The war ended 2 weeks ago. These are just armed men who haven't gotten the memo that it's time to go home. Breitner is among them. He doesn't resist the Canadians. He's not insane. He understands the Canadians represent legitimate authority in a way the Georgians never did. He surrenders his weapon, allows himself to be processed. The Canadians are professionals. They don't execute surrendering enemy troops, even ones who should have surrendered weeks earlier. But Kirk and his officers are impressed, even moved, by what they learn about the Georgians. These men fought against the Nazis when it mattered, when the outcome was still uncertain, when doing so meant certain death if captured. Kirk refuses to classify the 228 surviving Georgians as enemy combatants. He treats them as displaced persons. The final accounting of the Battle of Texel is staggering for an island barely 25 miles long. 565 Georgians killed, 812 Germans dead, 120 Dutch civilians caught in the crossfire or executed for helping. Some estimates put the German casualties higher, possibly over 1,000 when you count reinforcements whose bodies were never found. The physical destruction across the island approaches 10 million guilders in 1945 money. Dozens of farms burned to the ground, villages damaged, an entire community traumatized by 6 weeks of violence that should never have happened. This was Europe's last battlefield, a fight that continued for 2 weeks after the continent's bloodiest war officially ended. Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes, commanding officer of the 1st Canadian Army, is so moved by the Georgian story that he writes directly to Soviet command, urging clemency. It's a remarkable breach of protocol. The Yalta Conference established that all Soviet nationals would be repatriated to the USSR at war's end. No exceptions. But Foulkes argues these men aren't collaborators. They're resistance fighters who struck against the Nazis when the outcome still mattered. He praises their contribution to Allied victory. It doesn't help much. Soviet Smersh counterintelligence operatives arrive on Texel and take custody of the 228 survivors. What happens to them follows the typical Soviet pattern for repatriated prisoners. They're sent to camps, interrogated, their stories checked and rechecked. Some sources say most eventually returned to Georgia, though some were sent to punishment camps in Siberia. Even in defeat, he was thorough. At least 26 were singled out for particularly harsh treatment. Others remained too afraid to discuss their repatriation even years later. The Georgian cemetery on Texel holds 475 bodies, all but Lieutenant Loladze, unidentified, because Major Breitner destroyed all battalion headquarters documents before the Canadians arrived. Major Klaus Breitner survives the war. He's processed as a regular POW, eventually released. He lives for decades after Texel, dying of old age in Germany. When asked about the events on Texel in later years, his answer never changes. It was treachery, nothing else. He expresses no regret, no remorse, no acknowledgement that perhaps, just perhaps, hunting and executing men for weeks after the war ended might have been excessive. To his death, he believes he was right. The Georgians violated military law, he enforced that law. The timing, the circumstances, the fact that Germany had surrendered, none of it mattered in his accounting of justice. In Breitner's worldview, duty and honor demanded he continue fighting, and he did. The fact that it turned a beautiful island into a slaughterhouse was simply the cost of maintaining discipline. Klaus Breitner wasn't following orders from Berlin. Berlin had surrendered. He wasn't protecting German strategic interests. Germany had none left. He was following some internal code, some absolute belief that his duty transcended circumstances, transcended even the existence of the state he served. Here's the question that haunts anyone who studies Texel. What makes a man continue fighting after the war has ended? Not just continue fighting, but continue executing prisoners, burning farms, killing civilians, all in service of punishing a mutiny that happened in a war that no longer exists. You could call it fanaticism. You could call it rigid adherence to principle. You could call it the inability to accept that the world has changed and you need to change with it. The Georgians on Texel faced an impossible choice and made what they thought was the only play that gave them a chance to survive. They were wrong about a lot of things. The Allies didn't come to their rescue. Their uprising didn't end with liberation. But they were right about one thing. If they'd gotten on those trucks to Arnhem on April 6th, they'd all be dead. At least 228 of them survived by fighting. Breitner faced a choice too. When the surrender order came, when VE Day arrived, he could have stopped. Every other German commander in the Netherlands stopped. He chose to keep going, to keep the killing machine running, because in his mind, there was a principle at stake that was bigger than surrender, bigger than peace, bigger than mercy. That choice, that refusal to bend, turned what should have been a footnote into one of the war's most disturbing final chapters. Historians still debate whether to call him principled or monstrous. Maybe he was both. The Battle of Texel is one of those stories that almost disappeared from history. Most people have never heard of it, but it tells us something important about what happens when ideology trumps humanity, when following orders becomes more important than recognizing when the orders don't make sense anymore. If you found this story as compelling as we did, hit that subscribe button. We dig into the forgotten corners of World War II history every week, bringing you the stories that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment below. What do you think about Breitner's decision? Was he a principled officer doing his duty or a fanatic who couldn't accept defeat? We'll see you in the next one.